Good morning. Welcome to the house of the Lord. We get to continue our study and our trip through Acts. Now, we know we're in the 18th chapter of Acts this week, but last week, Paul, in chapter 17, he came up against the idolatry that was represented at Mars Hill. And he told them about the unknown God. And it's important that just because somebody believes in a God or in an unknown God, it's not good enough. What did we talk about last week? That God has to be named, and there is no access to that God except through Jesus. And that is a key component because we live in a world now in which people say, well, the Muslims worship a God, the Indians worship, the Native Americans worship a God. um, Everybody points to a God. But the key point there is no access to that except through Jesus. So if they relegate Jesus to anything else, a prophet, a good man, then they don't believe in the God of heaven, the God of Abraham, right? So that's the key point from last week's message. So this week, Paul is going to go to the city of Corinth. And let's just do a little history on Corinth. Do we know anything about Corinth? Corinthians, or Corinth, the city of. Where is it located? Well, we have a handy map out here which lays it out very clear. And and thanks to my technical department, they were able to find that and get that up there. That's wonderful. So Corinth is below Athens on an island. So I didn't realize this until I actually started looking at some historical facts about Corinth, that it was a huge city. There could have been close to 800,000 people in that area and surrounding area, because we'll find out today that Paul spent a lot of time there. And so, I was curious as to why he spent so much time. It's because the field was so huge. So, Corinth hadn't been around, forever. It had grown exponentially over the last 100 years, and it was about 48 miles below Athens, as we can see by the map there. And it was a very wealthy city because what can we say about its location? It was a port, wasn't it? And that's how all goods really came into um, countries and into it. It started at the port. And we still, even today, our ports is where everything from overseas comes in first. You know, um, so there is a lot of commerce that goes on there, which means there's a lot of wealth. And being that it's so close to Athens, it was a very idolatrous city also. So Paul's going to have to continually deal with that. And it was elevated above the actual port. It was some 1,800 feet from sea level. So I get the picture that it kind of uh, protruded from the ocean up to a big plain, and they had good vantage points. It was defendable, but it also had a temple of Aphrodite. And what do we know about that? It's the god of fertility. They were known for having prostitutes in the temple. It was just a very ungodly thing. And I only bring that up so that we have a clear picture of what Paul is up against. And when you see a temple like that, there's a lot of revenue generated from that type of worship. So Paul was dealing with a lot of false gods. So we will start in verse 1 of chapter 18. And after these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to be departed from Rome, and they came unto them. So, Aquila and Priscilla, in essence, there was a decree in Rome that anybody that was a Jew was to leave, expelled. And these were, these weren't poor people. He was a tent maker, he had a trade, so they had resources, but they had to leave. And it was even suggested that they may have been um, present at uh, uh, in the second chapter of Acts when the Comforter came upon the church. But that's not hard and cold fact. But they were believers and had been believers for some time. So, in verse 3, and because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought, for by the occupation they were tent makers. So Paul had taken up this this trade as a tent maker because traveling. I mean, how did he survive? How did he buy food? He had to work. And we see that in small churches that the pastor can't be supported, so they have to continue to work. Well, Paul is the example of that. He did whatever he had to do. Now, he got some support from churches. He did, but he couldn't. Wasn't like being on the mission field nowadays where you know you're going to get X amount of dollars, or you're pretty sure you're going to get a certain amount. He had no idea. So he had to have a trade, and it was a tent maker. And it just so happened that Aquila was a tent maker too. So they had a common bond when it came to work. So Paul stayed with them for a time. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. So what do we know about Paul? When it comes to the Sabbath, where does he go? He goes to the temple. Um, and he preaches Jesus, doesn't he? And it says here that he preached and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. Now that's important, isn't it? Because he is following Jesus' plan to bring the church to who? Everybody, isn't it? Paul did not deviate, and Paul had a strong um, concern, co- conviction for the Jews, didn't he? Being a Jew, being a rabbinical Jew, being a Pharisee, he had a strong desire for them to actually believe in the Messiah he studied as a kid because he knew the Old Testament very well, as evident in some of the chapters he wrote. Um, so he knew about the coming Messiah. He knew that it was foretold in the Old Testament. And he had this strong desire that the actual Jews, the keepers of the Old Testament, would recognize the Messiah. But he didn't deviate from Jesus' plan that all would have access. Now, it's interesting because you watch. I love period pieces. Trish and I both. We love period pieces. If we're watching series on TV, we love Victorian age, turn of the century because it's really interesting. Because I love history, and the one thing that is very evident in that time period is the class system. I mean, you just didn't cross classes. I mean, you would be ruined, could be ruined financially. Um, and it was very clear from Jesus that he wanted no class system, didn't he? He wanted the Jews and the Gentiles to be equal, to be accepted equally and to be um, treated the same. Now, if you've ever gone to a club, like a golf club that's a country club, we went to one in Montana that was very elite. They were so elite, they wouldn't even sell me a golf ball. Yeah, it was that. So the class system is still there, but it's divided with money now, isn't it? It's the haves and the have-nots. But it's still, I mean, they're very prejudiced. They only see one color, and that's green. Um, and that's not what Jesus wants. Jesus does not want us to be divided like that. He wants the wealthy and the poor to worship together. Because are they not worshiping the same God? In the same manner, do they not receive the same salvation? Is baptism not the same for them? Is discipleship different for the wealthy or the poor? It's all the same. It's exactly the same. And Paul perpetuated this message, didn't he? So in verse 5, and when Silas and Timothy were come to Macedonia, because we remember that Paul sent for them, right? Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. Now, what does it mean? He was pressed in the Spirit. What do you think that means? He was convicted. He was convicted. And we know, I just said how convicted Paul was for the Jews, but now he's been in the ministry years. He has that same desire and conviction for who? For the Gentiles. And he was concerned because he had been around all of these pagan religions staying there. So he preached and testified of the living Christ, the Messiah. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your own hands. I am clean. From henceforth, I will go unto the Gentiles. So here's where Paul says, all right, I am done beating my head against the wall. They got so angry with him that they were on the verge of blaspheming because they were attacking his message. Now, that was the charge that they always leveled against Paul and Jesus, wasn't it? He's committing blasphemy. All right, here they're doing the blasphemy because when they deny the Christ that Paul spoke about, is that not blasphemy? It is. And Paul called it out. And he got to the point where he said, that's it. I'm not going to waste any more time with you. Because apparently they were pretty thick-headed bunch of Jews. So from henceforth, I will go unto the Gentiles. They were out of control and disrespectful to his God. Now, do you get offended sometimes when somebody disrespects God? How do we see that in our daily lives? The most common way we see that is when somebody uses God's name in vain. And I still just, I stop people, you know? Like when I'm playing golf, the men's clubs, whoever rides with me, if they're cussing like that, I'll tell them. I said, listen, that's really offensive to me. If you want to cuss, that's your business. But there's a difference between cussing and using God's name in vain. Correct? So anyway, we should not be afraid to point that out to people, should we? But we're all guilty of it, aren't we? And sometimes it happens so fast we can't really throw it up. But in the scenario I just talked about, where I'm going to spend the next 3 hours writing with this person, I might as well just get it set off right from the beginning. And Trish has been with me playing golf and seen me do that and tell a guy, okay, my wife's here. You're going to have to not talk like that. That's offensive. Otherwise, we will separate and you can go ahead and play ahead of us and we'll play behind you. But we are not going to be in that environment today. And they did. So anyway, um, Paul did that. Paul pointed out the fact that they were blaspheming God. And he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one that worshiped God, whose house joined hard to the synagogues. Well, that's interesting. What do you think that means? That his house was joined hard to the synagogue, closely related to all the workings of the synagogue, close in proximity. He may have, but he worshiped God. So a new door had been opened for Paul, hadn't it? Do we see that in our lives? When one door closes, are we done? I mean, do you ever get to the point where you're witness somebody and they don't accept Jesus and they don't want to hear anymore? And you say, well, I'm done. And you stop witnessing? You shouldn't, because will God give you another opportunity to witness? Yeah. The map is evidence that always for evangelism. That is correct. And who does the evangelizing today? I'm looking at them, and they're looking at me. We are the evangelists. We're not asked to do what Paul did, are we? To be basically vagabonds going from city to city, preaching the word. We have it pretty comfortable, don't we? All we have to do is stand up in our work environment, or stand up with our friends, stand up with our family, our relatives. That's a lot easier than the path that Paul had to bear. So he spent time with Justus and um, Crispus, the chief ruler of the synagogues. So he was, it would have said high priest if he was the high priest, but he was the business manager for the synagogue, the main uh, rabbi. He was it. And what happened to him? He got saved. The preacher got saved. We've seen that in life before. When preachers find out, well, I understand and believe this. I even went to the seminary, but I never accepted Jesus into my heart. And they get saved. Well, that's what happened here. He had been an instructor, a chief instructor in the synagogue for who knows how long. And did Paul preach anything different to him? He preached about the risen Savior, didn't he? He said, and I'm paraphrasing what Paul said, but I feel that I know Paul. I mean, don't you feel that you know Paul's personality by what's in the Word? Um, I know that he stood here before this chief ruler and preached the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It pointed out this is the Messiah that you've been preaching about, the coming Messiah. And he believed on the Lord with all his house. And many of the Corinthians, hearing, believed and were baptized. So this was a big deal. The chief ruler of the synagogue got saved, then his household got saved, and that affected Corinth as a city. And many were believed and were baptized. And I explained yesterday in the Bible study what baptism was. That it's not a part of salvation, but it is a ceremony that we were given that we can go through to show those in our lives that we have been saved. We believe in the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And to see that people were going through that. And a key point here I want to make about verse 8 is because we've seen this many times that a person was saved and then their household was saved too. I think that's important because it shows us that salvation is contagious somewhat, especially in an environment like family. When you believe, and furthermore, when you believe and live a changed life, that rubs off on other people, doesn't it? I want what you have. And I've heard that from people. Why are you always singing? Because I'm happy, because I have Jesus in my heart. I have nothing really to worry about. Is that not, should that not be our daily message? It is, yeah, it should be. It goes back to that representative of Christ. We want to be a good representative and have a good um, reputation, not for myself, but for the Jesus I claim to serve, right? That's the reputation I do care about. Then spake the Lord to Paul in a night by a vision. Wow. So the Lord's got a bigger message for him. Be not afraid and speak, but speak and hold not thy peace. So he's empowering him. He's encouraging him. He's saying, Paul, you're doing a great job. Don't be fearful. Why would he need to say, don't be afraid? He didn't want him, because what had happened in the other cities? Eventually, the Jews got to a point where they wanted to kill Paul, so Paul would leave and move to a new city. But God gave him a direct commandment here: be not afraid. You've got more work to do here, and I'm going to protect you. Doesn't mean he's going to make everything perfect, is it? Doesn't mean Paul's not going to feel persecution, but it does mean that he's not going to lose his life by staying there. And hold not thy peace, which means don't hold back. Let the people that you come in contact with hear the message. Be bold, for I am with thee. And we need to remember that we are not alone, are we? I know we feel alone sometimes, don't we? Be honest. We can feel that way. But are we really? Can you be alone with people around you? You can if you withdraw into yourself and don't interact with people. But, and depression is a big thing these days, isn't it? Depression and anxiety. But when we withdraw into our minds, that feeds those feelings, doesn't it? So we need to remember that even if things are bad and we feel alone, we are not alone. If we are a child of God, if we have salvation in our heart, we are not alone. For I am with thee, and no man shall set on thee to hurt thee, for I have much people in the city. So, Paul, be not afraid. I'm going to protect you. I'm not going to let people hurt you because I've got a lot of people for you to talk to. Isn't that what he's saying? This field is big. I got a lot of work for you. And Paul, and he continued there for a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So that's a long time for Paul, isn't it? To stay. The only place he'd spent that much time was in Antioch, wasn't it? His home church. Yeah, and that part was in the church. It wasn't in the synagogue. But he's staying here, continuing to work in the synagogue for a year and a half. Huh? Oh, it wasn't strictly in the synagogue. No, he preached throughout the whole city, but he converted the synagogue, didn't he? Because there were believers there. And he didn't take a year and a half vacation or a sabbatical, did he? He continued to teach the word of God among them. And when um, Gallio was a deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat. So Gallio was what we would have heard was a proconsul, which means he was a Roman ruler set to rule over the city of Corinthians because it was still under Roman jurisdiction, wasn't it? So the Jews went to him and said, listen, this Paul is causing an insurrection in your city. You need to do something about it. You need to deal with this guy. Is this not the standard operating method for the Jews? So what did he do? They took Paul before him to his judgment seat. And in verse 13, saying, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Well, that's their accusation. This guy is encouraging people to not keep the law, basically, is what they're saying, isn't it? And they need to keep the Ten Commandments. They need to keep Jewish law. And he's telling them things that are different, that they don't have to keep the law anymore. And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or, oops, that's one too many pages, or wicked or lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would I bear with you. So if we're bringing accusation against Paul that he was lewd and wicked and hurting people, I would hear you. I would take this up because he would actually be breaking Roman law. Because wasn't that what the proconsul would be concerned with? So he put this to the Jews and their accusations. But if it be a question of words and names and of your laws, look to you ye to it. For I will be no judge of such matters. So this guy was kind of smart in a ruler's fashion because he divided out the fact that, okay, what Paul was preaching was an insurrection against Rome, was it? He was just preaching something different than the laws of the Old Testament. And he was at least had enough common sense to see and be able to divide that out. And he told them, you need to deal with it. Well, apparently they didn't have enough power to deal with it, did they? Otherwise, they wouldn't have brought him before the proconsul. So, if it be a question of words or names, your law, look to it, for I will be no judge of such a matter. And he did what? And he drave them from the judgment seat. So he kicked them out. He said, I'm done. So he washed his hands, but this was a little different than Pilate washing his hands, isn't it? He just said, I'm not doing anything to these guys. We're not throwing them in prison. We're not beating them. We're not doing anything because they are not breaking any laws of concern to our community. So that was good for him. So here, as we close, we know that Paul lived there for a year and a half. He worked and he preached the whole time. And he became a part of the community, didn't he? Because he wanted to make the word of God impact where he lived. He was more than just a traveling preacher at Corinth, wasn't he? That's why the church, he set up a church there. So we need to remember we need to be a part of the community, don't we? And be in the world but not of the world. We don't need to take on ungodly manners that are community related, do we? But we do need to be a part. We do not need to separate ourselves from the lost, do we? And we can do that at times, can't we? Isolate ourselves. Well, we've got the truth and we're going to keep it to ourselves. I hate to say that's been the attitude at times. We need to be open to those in our lives. Let's end with a song.